The chipped formica of the dashboard felt cool under my palm as I pulled into the parking lot. It was raining, a thin, persistent drizzle that made the streetlights smear across the wet asphalt. I was already late, 10 minutes, which wasn't ideal for a first impression, but honestly, the stress of just getting here had been enough. The interview had been last week, a quick rundown with a guy named Crane who mostly seemed interested in confirming I hadn't been convicted of anything. He hadn't asked about my experience, or why I needed the job, or anything like that. Just background checks and a key card. I kept replaying the last bill from the hospital in my head. $1,800 for one visit. Sarah hadn't complained. Not exactly, but I could see the way she'd tightened her jaw when she showed me, like she was embarrassed. The State Archive building was imposing. Not grand, not beautiful, just relentlessly solid. Gray concrete, a flat roof, very few windows. It looked like a place where things were kept, not where people worked. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of beat-up pickup trucks and a dark sedan. I killed the engine, the silence sudden after the hum of the highway. I needed this job. I needed it badly. Sarah's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, and the bank was starting to send increasingly pointed letters. Inside, it smelled like dust and old paper, and something else, a faint metallic tang. Not unpleasant, just noticeable. Crane met me by the front desk, barely looking up from a logbook. He handed me a key and a thick binder. Employee manual, procedures, that sort of thing. Read it over. I'll swing by later to go over the security protocols. He didn't offer a smile or a good luck or anything, just the key and the binder. He pointed toward a small security office near the back. That's your station. Camera monitors are already set up. Overnight shift. You know the drill. The security office was small and cramped. 4 monitors showing different angles of the building's hallways and loading docks. A desk, a chair, a coffee maker that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a decade. I dropped my bag onto the floor and opened the binder. Mostly standard stuff. Fire evacuation procedures, incident reporting forms, a section on maintaining the security system. Then, tucked between the section on first aid and a list of emergency contacts, I found it. A separate sheet of paper folded in thirds. It was typed, not printed, on what looked like an old typewriter. 8 numbered rules. 1. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Check every light switch on the first floor. Say each room aloud. Walk the perimeter once. Do not leave without completing it. I snorted. A little eccentric, but okay. Some buildings have weird traditions. 2. Do not photograph, record, or write down the contents of the East Wing storage vaults. Some things should not be documented. Okay, that was a bit stranger, but probably just sensitive historical documents. I imagined old land deeds, maybe military records. 3. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty and log the absence. Do not attempt to contact them. That felt unnecessarily harsh. But again, maybe it was a liability thing. Someone calls in sick. You don't want to be responsible for covering their post. 4. Monitor the water level marker in the basement stairwell. If the water rises above the red line, do not proceed to the lower level for the rest of the shift. A basement didn't seem that unusual. Basements flood. 5. If the basement door is found unlocked at shift start, lock it without opening it to check inside. Log that it was found unlocked. Do not investigate why. Now that was odd. Just lock it. No curiosity allowed? Still, probably just a preventative measure. Old building? Maybe a history of break-ins. 6. If someone addresses you as if they know you, but you do not recognize them, do not confirm or deny how you know them. Treat the interaction as a case of mistaken identity and disengage politely. That one gave me a little pause. Seemed paranoid. But maybe this building attracted a certain type. 7. Do not bring any items that are crimson onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. Crimson? Really? That was specific. I glanced down at my navy blue work shirt. Good. 8. Use only the established routes between the main office and the loading dock. Do not take shortcuts through unmarked or rarely used spaces. Fine. I'm not a shortcut kind of guy anyway. Honestly, the whole thing felt like a prank, or maybe some kind of test from Crane. See if I'd actually read the manual. I chuckled to myself. Rules for the night shift, I muttered, tossing the paper onto the desk. It felt silly to even think about it. I had bills to worry about, not mysterious building regulations. I spent the next hour familiarizing myself with the camera system, adjusting the monitors and trying to get the ancient coffee maker to cooperate. It sputtered and gurgled, finally producing a cup of something vaguely coffee-flavored. I was starting to feel a little more settled, a little less anxious. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m., still a long night ahead. As I turned back to the monitors, I noticed something. The light in the hallway outside the East Wing storage vaults was flickering, just a quick flash, barely noticeable. Probably just a bad bulb. Still, I found myself staring at that hallway for a long moment, a little prickle of unease settling at the back of my neck. I shook it off. Just a long night, a weird building, and a lot of pressure. That was all. I was cataloging boxes in the West Wing, mostly old tax records from the 1970s. Tedious work. Everything smelled like dust and brittle paper, a dry papery scent that coated the back of my throat. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. The kind of old that makes you think about all the things that have been forgotten, all the lives lived and then filed away in boxes. I had a system going, scanning the box labels, entering the contents into the digital inventory, and then stacking them neatly for transport to the off-site storage facility. It was mindless, but it kept my hands busy and my mind from drifting too much toward the mortgage and Gloria's appointments. The coffee had worn off hours ago, leaving me with a dull ache behind my eyes. I kept checking the clock, willing the minutes to move faster. 2:30 a.m., 4 more hours. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through the playlist I'd made, and settled on some old Springsteen. Born to Run started up, and I found myself tapping my foot along to the beat. A small, defiant act of normalcy in this silent, echoing building. The music helped a little. It reminded me of road trips with Gloria, windows down, singing at the top of our lungs. Around 3 o'clock, Crane called. Not about a problem, just checking in. He seemed eager, asked if I was following the procedures, if I'd read the manual thoroughly. I told him everything was fine. A little boring, actually. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound over the phone. Good, good. Just stay diligent, Kieran. It's a quiet place, but it has its peculiarities. Peculiarities? That word again? He hung up quickly, without any further explanation. I stared at the phone for a moment, wondering what he meant. Probably just trying to justify his job. The rest of the shift passed without incident. No flickering lights, no strange noises, just the endless rows of boxes and the steady hum of the ventilation system. As 5 a.m. approached, I started my final rounds, checking each office, making sure the doors were locked, the lights were off, everything was as it should be. Then I remembered. I was the last one here. I walked back to the main office, located the sheet with the rules again, and read through it. A little more carefully this time, I found the last rule, the one about leaving. It was longer than I remembered. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Check every light switch, ensuring they are in the off position. Say each room aloud, acknowledging its emptiness. Walk the perimeter once, observing the exterior of the building. I frowned. A little theatrical, even for this place, but I needed the paycheck. I started with the lights. Methodically, I went through each office, flipping the switches to the off position. Then, I moved on to the rooms. Main office, I said, my voice echoing in the silence. Records room, break room, West Wing storage, each room, each word felt strangely important. I finished with the perimeter walk, circling the building, peering into the darkness. The air was cold, damp. It smelled like wet concrete and decaying leaves. I checked the loading dock doors, the fire escapes, the windows, everything secure. I double-checked everything. Lights, rooms, perimeter, it felt complete. I grabbed my jacket, locked the main office door, and headed for the exit. As I reached the front entrance, I glanced back. Just a quick look, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the lobby, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure, tall and thin, like a stretched-out silhouette. It wasn't moving, it wasn't doing anything, it just was. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Fatigue, stress. I'd been working all night, staring at dark corners. My brain was playing tricks on me. It had to be. I hurried out the door, locked it behind me, and practically ran to my car. I started the engine, put the car in reverse, and pulled out of the parking lot. As I drove, I kept replaying the image in my mind. That figure, it hadn't been a shadow. It had been shaped like a person. It hadn't been moving, but it hadn't been still either. It had felt aware. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just exhaustion, but the prickling sensation on the back of my neck wouldn't go away. I briefly recalled a phrase from the rule sheet, "Do not acknowledge." I hadn't acknowledged it. I hadn't spoken to it, but I had seen it. I should have walked the perimeter again. I hadn't noticed anything during the first walk, but maybe, just maybe, if I'd been paying closer attention, I would have seen something. I hadn't completed the ritual properly. I'd been rushing, eager to get home. I'd skipped a step, a small step, but a step nonetheless. I pulled over to the side of the road, switched off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring into the darkness. The feeling of unease was growing, tightening its grip around my chest. This wasn't just fatigue. This wasn't just stress. Something wasn't right. I needed to go home. I needed to see Gloria. But even as I started the car again, I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't leaving it behind. Whatever it was, it had come home with me. The diner across from the archive was still open, a beacon of greasy comfort in the pre-dawn gloom. I pulled into a booth, ordered black coffee and a stack of pancakes, and just sat there for a few minutes, letting the warmth chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Gloria would be up soon, getting ready for the day. Maybe I could swing by and see her before heading home to try and get some sleep. The pancakes were thick and sweet, exactly what I needed. I scrolled through the local news on my phone while I ate, mostly stories about school board meetings and traffic accidents. Nothing interesting, nothing that made me forget about the shape in the lobby. I tried to focus on the pancakes, on the steam rising from my coffee, on the chipped formica of the table. Normal things. I needed normal. Old Man Hemlock, the owner of the diner, shuffled over to refill my coffee. "Rough night, Kieran?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I'd been coming here for years, even before the archive job. He knew me. "Just tired, Hemlock," I said, forcing a smile. "Long shift." "Those old buildings, they get to you. A lot of history in those walls. Some of it isn't pleasant." He paused, then added, "You're a good man taking that job. Gloria needs you." I nodded, grateful for his quiet support. Trying to be. After finishing the pancakes, I felt a little better. Still uneasy, but functioning. I decided to document everything, just to get it out of my head, to have a clear record of what happened. I opened the Notes app on my phone and started typing. Shift started as usual. West Wing Patrol, no issues. Completed exit ritual, lights off, rooms named, perimeter walk. Saw figure in lobby after locking up. Tall, thin, obscured by shadows, disappeared when I looked again. I added a few more details, trying to be as objective as possible. Date, time, specific locations. As I was typing, I remembered the employee manual, the stack of rules. I'd skimmed them, dismissed them as bureaucratic nonsense. But now I wasn't so sure. I pulled out my phone, navigated to the photos I'd taken of the rule sheet on my first day. I scrolled through them, stopping at the last page. There it was, Rule 20. Do not photograph, record, or write down specific things. Some things should not be documented. I stared at the words, my gut twisting. The bracketed phrase was a blur. What? Specific things? The rule was infuriatingly vague. Was a description of a shadow considered documentation? Was a simple log of events a violation? I told myself it was ridiculous. It was just an overcautious, needlessly complicated rule. Probably meant to prevent people from taking pictures of sensitive documents. I was just describing what I saw. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The prickling on my neck intensified. The memory of that shape in the lobby felt sharper, more defined. I thought about the way it hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. It had just been, and now I'd put it into words, into a digital record. Potentially what? I didn't even know what I'd done. I hesitated. Delete it? Erase the note, pretend it never happened? It felt wrong, like admitting I was afraid of a shadow. But the rule was clear enough in its intention. Some things were better left unsaid, undocumented. I took a deep breath and deleted the note, every single word. It felt like a small act of defiance, and also a surrender. A tiny shiver ran down my spine, colder than anything the archive's damp air had produced. I paid for my breakfast, thanked Hemlock, and headed back to the archive. I needed to get back inside, to retrace my steps, to see if I'd missed something during the perimeter walk, something that could explain what I'd seen. I unlocked the front door, the heavy metal clicking echoing in the silence. As I stepped inside, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible scent. Not the usual musty smell of old paper and dust. This was different. Like ozone, but sweeter, and clinging to the air, a subtle static charge made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I walked towards the lobby and knew, with a growing sense of dread, that the air felt different inside now. It wasn't just my imagination. Something had shifted. Something was waiting. The fluorescent lights in the records room hummed, a low throb that vibrated through the metal shelving. I was reshelving archival maps, mostly property records from the early 20th century. Tedious work, but it was something to do, something to occupy my hands and my mind, to push back against the feeling from when I'd walked in. It was still there, a subtle pressure in the air, but less acute. I told myself it was just the building settling, the old pipes groaning, anything but what my gut suggested. The maps themselves were fascinating, in a detached sort of way. Tiny, meticulously drawn plots of land, the names of long-dead farmers and landowners scrawled across them in faded ink. I found myself tracing the boundaries of old orchards, imagining the lives that had unfolded on those now subdivided acres. It was a welcome distraction. Gloria, the archivist, had given me a crash course on the indexing system before she left. She said it was the most boring part of the job, but also the most important. "Everything needs to be in its place, Kieran," she'd said, her voice dry and precise. "Chaos is the enemy of preservation." I was halfway through a box of maps when Ned, the day security guard, called down on the radio, his voice crackled with static. "Kieran, you copy?" "Copy, Ned," I replied, adjusting the headset. "Just letting you know, Oren called in sick. He has the flu, he says. He's feeling rough. He was supposed to start his shift at 8. "Okay," I said. "Anything I need to do?" There was a pause, a burst of static. "Just cover his station, I guess. Check the West Wing every hour on the hour. Standard stuff. I already logged the absence with Gloria. She'll deal with the scheduling." I hesitated. Cover Oren's station. The West Wing was huge, a labyrinth of storage rooms and restricted access areas. It would mean splitting my focus, leaving the records room unattended for longer periods. And something about Ned's tone, the way he hadn't directly told me to cover it, more like suggested it. I remembered the employee manual, the stack of rules. It had been a blur, a cascade of bizarre regulations, but one phrase kept surfacing, a nagging echo in the back of my mind. Something about absences. If a coworker doesn't appear for their shift and doesn't call, do not cover their station. Leave it empty. It wasn't the exact wording, but the gist of it was there. A cold feeling settled in my chest. It seemed ridiculous, of course. Just another pointless rule designed to trip people up. Oren was sick. Someone needed to ensure the West Wing was secure. It was the responsible thing to do. But the image of that phrase, that insistent prohibition, wouldn't fade. I pictured the empty security station, the blank logbook, the unspoken acknowledgement of an absence. It felt significant. I couldn't explain why. It just felt like a line that shouldn't be crossed. "Ned," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'll stick to the records room for now. You can handle the West Wing. You know the layout better than I do." There was another, longer pause. "Kieran, are you sure? It's a big area. I'm already covering my own rounds." "I'm sure," I repeated more firmly this time. "I'm comfortable with the records room. I can keep an eye on the security cameras and monitor the alarm system from here." Ned sighed. "All right, if you say so. But if anything happens—" "I understand," I said, cutting him off. "I'll be vigilant." I ended the transmission, my hand shaking slightly. I felt foolish, irrational. I'd chosen a bureaucratic rule over common sense, over a basic sense of responsibility. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd avoided something important, a silent alarm. I returned to the maps, but my focus was gone. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the fluorescent lights, felt loaded with meaning. I kept glancing towards the west wing, imagining the empty security station, the silent halls. I needed to know what was going on. I needed to check on Oren, but I'd made my decision. I'd followed the rule. Now, I was left with the gnawing weight of unanswered questions and the unsettling certainty that something was profoundly wrong. And the thing I needed to know, the thing I should have checked on, was now, by my own hand, left unobserved. I was cataloging the microfilms, batch 37B, county tax records from 1923. Tedious work, but it filled the time. The little reels were brittle, smelled faintly of vinegar and dust, and the machine whirred with a comforting mechanical rhythm. I'd rigged up a small battery-powered radio, tuned to a static-filled station playing old jazz, Miles Davis, I think, or maybe Dizzy Gillespie. It all blended together after a while. The fluorescent lights above hummed. I kept noticing the way the dust motes danced in the beams. It wasn't a clean place, this archive, despite all the security and regulations, more preserved, like a museum of forgotten things allowed to accumulate a patina of age. Old buildings always had their quirks. I'd spent enough time in my grandmother's house to know that. Each creak, each settling sound, a little story of the structure breathing. I was halfway through the batch, carefully entering the information into the digital database, property owner, parcel number, assessed value, when I remembered the water level. It was part of my rounds, checking the gauge in the sub-basement. A pointless task, really. The archive was built on high ground, miles from the river. Ned had explained it was an old requirement, something to do with the building's original construction, a precaution. I finished the reel, carefully rewound it, and labeled the box with a small sticker. 37B completed. It felt good to have something finished, something concrete in a job that was mostly just being present. Being a reassuring, visible sign of authority. A warm body making sure nothing happened. The sub-basement was colder, always. Damp, too. The air hung heavy, smelling of concrete and something else, earthy almost, like wet stone. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The gauge was tucked away in a small alcove, a simple metal rod rising inside a clear plastic tube, marked with black lines. It was right on the line. Exactly. The highest mark. I blinked, then checked again. The light wavered slightly in my hand. It hadn't moved, but it had been a couple of hours since my last round. I'd been lost in the tax records, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled over me since Ned asked me to cover Oren's shift. A coincidence, I told myself. Just a coincidence. The water level probably fluctuated with the temperature, with the pressure in the pipes. It wasn't an indicator of anything. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the gauge. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. I ran a hand over the rough concrete wall, feeling the cold seep into my skin. It didn't feel right, it felt deliberate, like the water was holding its breath. That rule, the one about the water, came back to me in fragments. Something about not going down there if it reached a certain point, something about keeping what was below contained. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the impression was clear. Stay up here, don't go down. I didn't hesitate. I didn't weigh the options. I didn't tell myself I was overreacting. I just turned and walked back towards the stairs, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. As I climbed the steps, I glanced back down into the sub-basement. The alcove was swallowed by darkness. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, just the heavy, silent weight of the building pressing down. I made a note in the logbook, water level at maximum. No access to lower levels for remainder of shift, and continued my rounds, sticking to the upper floors. I avoided the staircase leading down, the one that now felt like a sealed doorway. The rest of the night passed without incident. The jazz played on, the microfilms whirred, and the building settled into its quiet, watchful existence. But I couldn't shake the image of that gauge, the metal rod poised at the edge of the mark, the darkness lurking below. I'd followed the rule. I hadn't gone down there, and that, I realized, was the most unsettling part of all. I would never know what I'd avoided, what was waiting in the darkness, what the water was holding back. I was inventorying the microfilms, Section 4B, local property records from the 1950s. Tedious work, but it broke up the night. Each reel had a number, a date, a brief description. I'd scan the description, check it against the manifest, initial the form. Repeat. It was the kind of task that let my mind wander, which honestly was the whole point. Tonight, I was thinking about Gloria. She'd been asking about the college fund for Timmy. It felt wrong, even thinking about it, like I was spending money that wasn't mine. The reels were stored in a climate-controlled room off the main corridor, a small space packed floor to ceiling with gray metal cabinets. The air in there was always different, cooler, drier. It smelled faintly of vinegar, I always thought. It wasn't unpleasant, just old, like a forgotten attic. I had the radio on low, some old Creedence Clearwater Revival. Fortunate Son was playing, a bitter irony given my current situation. Fortunate, right? I was halfway through the section, my pen scratching across the manifest, when I realized I hadn't checked the basement. It was part of the routine. A quick walkthrough, make sure everything was secure. I hadn't even thought about it, which was weird. I usually ticked it off mentally after the first round. I must have gotten lost in the property records. The basement door was at the end of the corridor, a heavy steel thing with a simple keypad lock. I walked towards it, humming along with the music, and that's when I noticed it. The door was ajar, not wide open, just cracked, maybe an inch, enough to see a sliver of blackness inside. My first thought was that someone had forgotten to close it properly. Maybe one of the day staff, or maybe Ned doing his rounds before leaving. But Ned was meticulous. He always double-checked everything, and I hadn't seen him on the security cameras. I paused, my hand hovering over the keypad. It felt off. The air around the door was colder, even than the microfilm room, and that vinegar smell was stronger, almost acrid. I remembered something then, a phrase from the employee handbook, something about the basement door. It wasn't a formal rule, not exactly, more like a cautionary note. Something about if you found it unlocked, you weren't to open it to investigate, just lock it, log it, and don't ask questions. It had been buried in a section about security protocols, easy to miss. I'd skimmed it during orientation, dismissed it as bureaucratic overreach, probably related to vandalism or kids trying to sneak in. It was just a door. I could check it, make sure everything was all right. A quick peek wouldn't hurt. I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. Then the ventilation system sputtered. Just a brief hiccup, a momentary surge in the airflow. But it was enough. It rattled the metal cabinets in the microfilm room, sending a shiver down my spine. And underneath it I heard something else. A faint scraping sound, coming from inside the basement, like something dragging across concrete. I retracted my hand. The scraping stopped. I didn't analyze it. I didn't try to rationalize it. I didn't tell myself it was just the building settling or rats, or my imagination running wild. I just locked the door. The mechanism clicked shut with a solid, reassuring thud. I wrote in the logbook, basement door found ajar upon routine check. Secured and locked. No entry. I didn't mention the scraping sound. I didn't mention the cold air. I didn't mention the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I stood there for a moment, staring at the steel door, my hand still resting on the keypad. The music on the radio had changed, switching to a somber piano ballad. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The whole building felt like it was holding its breath. I did another round, skipping the corridor with the microfilm room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind that door. I kept checking the security monitors, scanning the hallways, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Just empty corridors and flickering fluorescent lights. I kept hearing things, faint sounds just at the edge of my perception, a whisper, a creak, a rustling. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, that the stress was getting to me. But the feeling persisted, the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was loose in the archive. I spent the rest of the shift glued to the security cameras, jumping at every shadow, every flicker. The documentation rule felt heavier now. The images I had committed to the logbook felt like a beacon. I hadn't seen anything down there, but I'd acknowledged something was wrong. I hadn't opened the door. I hadn't looked inside, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was the right decision, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there, it now knew I was here, and it was listening. I was cataloging the old city ordinances, microfilm reels mostly, zoning laws from the 1950s, building permits from the 1930s. Tedious stuff, but it kept my hands busy and my mind occupied, I guess. It was better than pacing, better than staring at the security monitors. The fluorescent lights in the records room hummed with a steady, irritating buzz. The smell was always the same: dust, old paper, and something faintly metallic, like aging film stock. I'd started arranging the reels chronologically, hoping to make some sense of the chaos. It wasn't required, just something to do. Gloria, the day shift archivist, had mentioned they were planning a full reorganization soon, something about a new digital indexing system. I doubted it would happen. This place was a monument to inertia. Everything moved slowly, if it moved at all. Around 2:17 a.m., I heard a cough. A real cough, not the building settling. It came from the lobby, near the entrance. I glanced at the security monitors. Nothing, just the empty reception area, bathed in the pale blue light of the emergency exit sign. I figured it was just my imagination. Sound carries strangely in this building. Echoes bounce off the concrete and steel. Then I heard a voice. "Kieran? Is that you, Kieran?" It was a man's voice, friendly, almost jovial. I looked again at the monitors. Still nothing. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. My stomach tightened. This felt different than the scraping I'd heard by the basement. This felt directed. I walked to the lobby, keeping my hand close to the radio. Not for protection, just comfort, I suppose. Old habits. The lobby was empty. The front doors were closed and locked, just as I'd left them. The only light came from the exit sign and the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the frosted glass windows. "Hello?" I called out cautiously. "Just thought I'd say hello," the voice said. It seemed to come from everywhere. Not loud, not booming, but surrounding me. "Haven't seen you around here before, new security guard?" I scanned the lobby again, slowly, deliberately. Nothing. No one. I checked the corners, behind the potted plant, even under the reception desk. Empty. Yeah," I said, feeling a prickle of sweat on my forehead. "Just started a few weeks ago." Good. Glad to see they're keeping up security. Important work, this. Preserving history, you know?" The voice chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. My mind raced. Could someone have snuck in? Maybe a homeless person who'd found a way to hide. But the doors were locked. The alarm hadn't triggered, and that voice, it wasn't shouting, wasn't trying to hide. It was unnervingly casual. Then I remembered something. A fragment of the paperwork I'd been given on my first day. Something about interactions. About not acknowledging familiarity if you didn't recognize the person. Something about not confirming or denying. The rule. It felt distant, hazy, like a dream I'd almost forgotten. I told myself it was ridiculous, a paranoid security protocol dreamed up by some overzealous bureaucrat. But the feeling of unease was growing. It felt wrong. "Right?" I said, forcing a smile. "It's a good building. Lots of interesting records." I kept my voice light, deliberately vague. I'm still getting my bearings, to be honest. Of course. It takes time." I used to volunteer here years ago. Wonderful place. Say, you remind me of someone I knew. Can't quite place it. The voice trailed off, then came back, stronger. Never mind, probably just my imagination. I backed away slowly toward the records room. Well, it was nice meeting you. I've got to get back to my rounds. You do that. Don't want to let anything happen on your watch. I turned and walked briskly back to the records room, not running, but moving quickly. I didn't look back. I didn't say another word. I focused on the microfilm reels, on the humming of the lights, on anything but the voice. It wasn't a homeless person, it wasn't a prank, it was something else. Something that knew my name. And the rule had been clear. Don't acknowledge the familiarity, don't confirm, don't deny. I sat back down at my desk, my hands clammy. I tried to convince myself it was stress, lack of sleep, the monotony of the job. But a cold dread was settling in. Whatever that was, it hadn't been deterred by my polite dismissal. It hadn't vanished. It had just waited. I checked the security monitors again. Still nothing. But now, the empty hallways felt less empty, and the shadows seemed to lengthen and shift, as if something was moving just beyond the range of the cameras. I noticed the logbook was open to the page where I'd documented the basement door. I hadn't written anything else since. I stared at the entry, at my own handwriting. It felt like a confession, a marking of territory. I closed the book. I needed to make another round, but this time I wasn't checking for intruders. I was checking to see if I was still alone. And I had a terrible feeling that I wasn't. The water level rule suddenly felt much more pressing. I hadn't been to the lower levels since noticing the mark. Now, I desperately didn't want to, but I knew with a sickening certainty that something had changed. The archive wasn't just holding its breath anymore, it was watching me. I was doing inventory in the map room, not actual maps, not the kind you'd spread out on a table. These were architectural plans, blueprints for state buildings going back to the 1920s, rolled up, tied with faded ribbon, stacked in acid-free boxes. It was tedious, cross-referencing box numbers with a digital database, but quiet. The map room was on the third floor, away from the main entrance, buffered by layers of storage. It smelled like old paper and dust, a dry, brittle scent. I'd brought a travel mug of coffee, black, strong, the kind Gloria at the diner made. It was the only thing getting me through these shifts. The database was glitching, freezing every few minutes. I'd reported it to Ned, but he just shrugged and said it was short-staffed. Everything was short-staffed. I was short on sleep, short on patience, and rapidly approaching short on funds. The medical bills were relentless. I checked the clock. 2:17 a.m., 4 more hours of dusty boxes and frozen screens. I took a sip of coffee. It was lukewarm now, but still welcome. I went back to scanning the barcode on the next box. 34B7, nothing in the database. I tried again, still nothing. I jiggled the scanner, held it at a different angle. Finally, it registered. I logged it, moved to the next box. This one was heavier, the ribbon frayed. As I lifted it, I caught a glimpse of the mug. Bright yellow. A ridiculous sunshine yellow. My daughter Tess had picked it out for me last Christmas. Said it would cheer me up. And then I remembered something. A flicker of a memory. Something I'd skimmed over while reading through the guard instructions on my first night. Something about colors. Certain colors being problematic. It wasn't a clear rule. Not like the basement door or the water level. It was more of a warning buried in a long list of do's and don'ts. Something about not bringing specific items onto the premises. I couldn't recall the exact wording. I dismissed it then, figured it was about flammable materials or something. But now, staring at this intensely yellow mug. It was probably nothing, just some overly cautious regulation dreamed up by someone in risk management. I hadn't seen anything in the logs about color restrictions, and honestly, what harm could a yellow coffee mug do? It was just a mug. A silly, cheerful mug. I took another sip of coffee, trying to reassure myself. It tasted a little metallic, but that was probably just the mug, or maybe I was just imagining things. Everything felt heightened lately. The silence felt louder, the shadows deeper. But the feeling persisted, a prickle at the back of my neck. The image of the instruction sheet, the vague warning about colors, kept flashing in my mind. I remembered now. The document mentioned something about marking someone as a target. Or an offering. It was horribly vague. I was being ridiculous. It was a mug. A completely innocuous, albeit garishly colored mug. But the familiar stranger rule kept looping in my head. Don't acknowledge the familiarity. Don't confirm. Don't deny. It felt like this was the same kind of potential. A potential problem I wasn't equipped to assess. I carefully placed the mug inside my backpack, zipped it closed. It felt wrong. Like I was hiding something I shouldn't be. Like I was acknowledging a threat that wasn't there. I continued with the inventory, the database still glitching, the silence still pressing in. But now the quiet felt different. It felt expectant. The air in the map room felt colder, even though the temperature hadn't changed. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a steady thrumming that seemed to vibrate through my skull. I checked the security monitors again. Nothing, just empty hallways and rows of boxes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. I finished the inventory, logged the last box. 3:02 a.m. I decided to take a break, walk a different route back to my desk. I needed to move to clear my head. As I walked, I noticed a faint smell, not the usual dusty scent of the archive. This was different. It smelled like ozone, like static electricity, and underneath that, something else, something sweet, like overripe fruit. I passed the records room, glanced inside. The microfilm reels were still spinning silently, illuminated by the pale glow of the monitors. Everything looked normal, but as I moved on, I noticed something odd, a single sheet of paper lying on the floor just outside the records room door. It hadn't been there before. Yellow, a bright sunshine yellow, the same shade as my mug. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept walking, my pace quickening. The ozone smell was stronger now, almost overpowering. I reached my desk, sat down, and logged the incident in the security report. Found yellow paper outside records room, no identifying marks. I didn't mention the mug, I didn't mention the rule, I just wanted to get through the night. I checked the security monitors one last time, scanning each hallway, each storage room. Everything was still clear, but I knew with a growing sense of dread that I wasn't alone. And I had a feeling that the yellow paper wasn't a warning. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. And now, I was definitely being watched. I needed more coffee, but I wasn't reaching for my backpack. Not yet. I needed to check the fire suppression system in the East Wing. It was a quarterly task, a quick visual inspection of the nozzles and a check of the pressure gauges. Tedious but necessary. The archive was full of irreplaceable items, old deeds and blueprints mostly, but still, paper burns. I grabbed my flashlight and the checklist from my desk, double-checking I hadn't left anything important behind. The coffee hadn't helped much with the tiredness. It just made my stomach feel jittery. The East Wing was mostly storage, long rows of metal shelves packed with boxes. The air was always a few degrees cooler there, and the dust seemed thicker, even after Gloria had gone through with the cleaning crew last week. I started at the far end, systematically working my way down each aisle. Nozzle clear, gauge reading normal. Nozzle clear, gauge reading normal. It was monotonous, but the rhythm was almost soothing. I put on some Dire Straits. Brothers in Arms, a quiet one, figuring it wouldn't draw too much attention if anything was listening. The idea felt foolish, but I couldn't shake it. I was on aisle 7 when I realized there was a shortcut. A narrow passageway between rows of shelves that would cut at least 5 minutes off the walk back to my desk. I'd noticed it before, a gap that didn't appear on any of the maps. It looked like it had been there for years, maybe decades, probably just a forgotten access route from when the building was first built. It wasn't marked, definitely not official, but it looked perfectly safe. And honestly, 5 minutes felt like an eternity right now. I hesitated for a moment. I remembered something from the instruction sheet, something about sticking to the designated routes, not venturing off the beaten path. It wasn't a hard rule, not like the one about the water levels or the last one out. More of a guideline, I figured. A suggestion. It was probably just to keep things organized, prevent people from getting lost. Besides, I wasn't going far off course. It was just a small gap between shelves. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, just being paranoid. The yellow mug, the voice, the paper, it was all getting to me. I was letting it get to me. I needed to be professional, to treat this like a normal job, and a normal job didn't involve obsessing over unmarked passageways. I took a deep breath and stepped into the gap. It was darker than I expected. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom. The air was still thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something earthy, like damp soil. The passageway was surprisingly long, stretching further than it had looked from the aisle. The floor was uneven, covered in a layer of dust and what felt like tiny pebbles. My boots crunched with each step. I could feel the walls closing in on either side, the metal shelves looming like silent sentinels. Then I noticed it, or rather, the lack of it. There was no dust on the floor in the very center of the passageway, a clear, unbroken line, as if someone or something had walked this way recently, and not just recently, but regularly. The dust on either side of the line was undisturbed, a good half-inch thick. It was a stark contrast, a clear indication that this wasn't just a forgotten shortcut. It was maintained. A coldness settled in my stomach, a sensation that had nothing to do with the temperature. It wasn't just that the path was clear, it was that it was too clear. It was as if someone was expecting someone to use it and had made sure it was passable. I stopped walking, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a cleaning crew member used this route sometimes, even though it wasn't on the official cleaning schedule. Maybe a maintenance worker. Someone who just preferred a quicker way to get around. But that didn't explain the consistent, perfectly straight line. It didn't explain the feeling that I was intruding, that I wasn't supposed to be here. The instruction sheet flashed in my mind again, the vague warning about established routes. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a boundary, a line I shouldn't have crossed. I should have taken the long way around. I should have stuck to the marked aisles. I turned around, practically stumbling over my own feet, in my haste to get back to the familiar, well-lit aisles. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on me. I burst back into aisle 7, breathing heavily, and immediately checked my watch. It hadn't even been 5 minutes, maybe 3, but it felt like an hour. I finished the fire suppression check, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The silence felt heavier, the shadows deeper, the music on my phone sounded tinny and distorted. And when I got back to my desk, I noticed something was missing. The security log, the one I'd been meticulously keeping since day one, documenting every oddity, every unexplained event. It was gone, not misplaced, gone, vanished. I searched everywhere, checked under the desk, in the filing cabinets, even in the trash can. Nothing. Just an empty space where it should have been. And I hadn't logged the shortcut. I hadn't documented crossing that line. And now I couldn't. The thought settled on me like a weight, a cold, heavy certainty. I hadn't just broken a rule. I'd erased a record. I'd made myself invisible to my own documentation. The shift ended like any other, with the automatic doors sliding open and the cold morning air rushing in. I handed my keys to Crane, barely making eye contact. He just nodded, already scrolling through his phone. I didn't offer any explanation, didn't mention the log, didn't mention anything. What was there to say? That I'd lost a notebook? That I'd taken a wrong turn? It would sound insane. The drive home was quiet. I kept the radio off. I didn't want to hear anyone talking, didn't want any extra noise, just the hum of the engine and the swish of the tires on the highway. I hadn't slept properly in days, and I knew I wouldn't tonight either. But I was going home. To Sarah. To a normal life, or as normal as it could be. I tried to tell myself it was stress, that the archive was just a creepy old building, and my imagination was running wild. The yellow mug, the voice, the missing log, it was all just coincidence, right? A confluence of unfortunate events. I'd been working too hard, worrying too much about the bills, about Sarah's treatment. It was enough to make anyone see things. I wasn't buying it myself, but it was all I had. Sarah was already awake when I got in, sitting up in bed with a cup of tea. She smiled when she saw me. A small, tired smile. "How was it?" she asked. "Fine," I said. Quiet. Nothing happened. A lie, but a necessary one. I didn't want to worry her. I didn't want to explain something I didn't understand myself. I went through the motions, showered, ate breakfast, tried to act like everything was okay, but it wasn't. It hadn't been okay for a while, and I had a feeling it wouldn't be for a long time. I kept glancing at doorways, at corners, expecting something. I didn't know what. Just a feeling of being watched. The archive had gotten under my skin. I found myself checking the locks on the house twice before bed. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding narrow alleyways and dark streets, and I started noticing things, patterns, arrangements. Like the books on Sarah's shelves, she's a teacher, always has been, so we have a lot of books. Always have. But I started rearranging them, instinctively, not alphabetically, not by subject, by color. Grouping the reds together, the blues, the greens. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. I'd just pick up a book and move it, then another, until the shelves were a neat spectrum of hues. Sarah noticed, of course. "What are you doing?" she asked one evening, watching me rearrange a stack of novels. "Just organizing," I said, feeling my cheeks flush. "Thought it might look nicer?" She gave me a strange look. "You've never cared about the color of the books before?" I shrugged. "Just a whim." It wasn't a whim. It was a compulsion. A need to impose order on chaos. To create a sense of control in a world that felt increasingly random and unpredictable. I tried to stop, to go back to the way things were, but I couldn't. My hand would reach for a book, my eyes would scan the shelves, and before I knew it, I'd be rearranging again. I quit the job at the archive after 2 weeks. Told Crane I'd found something else. Didn't mention the missing log, the voice, or the passageway. Just said it wasn't a good fit. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seem to care. The medical bills are still piling up. I've taken a job driving for a delivery service. It's exhausting, and the pay isn't great, but it's something. It's enough to keep the lights on, to keep Sarah's treatment going. I was at a diner last night, waiting for a pickup order. The diner was mostly empty, just a few late-night stragglers. I noticed the salt and pepper shakers on the table, red and black, and without thinking, I pushed them apart, separated the colors, created a little space between them. I stopped mid-bite, halfway through a greasy burger. My fork clattered against the plate. I stared at the shakers, realizing what I'd done. I hadn't even consciously registered the color. It just happened. Automatically. A reflex. I looked around the diner. Everything seemed off. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. The red vinyl booths, the black floor tiles, the white Formica countertops. Too much contrast, too much visual noise. I finished my burger quickly, ignoring the half-formed thought that I should rearrange the ketchup and mustard bottles. I needed to get back on the road. Another delivery, another night, another carefully curated world, one small separation at a time. The ad for the overnight security position at the State Archive was still online when I checked this morning. It's been up there for weeks.